Beneath the golden sun that bathed the plains of Persepolis, the world once bowed before men who ruled not just through the sword, but through the seductive spell of pleasure. The Persian Empire, vast, glittering and terrifyingly organized, stretched from the banks of the Indus to the shores of the Aegean. It was the first superpower of civilization, a kingdom that mastered not only war and administration but the far subtler art of control through desire. To the Persians, power was not simply exercised through fear or punishment, it was embodied in beauty, ritual, and indulgence. Their kings understood that a man's deepest chains were not forged of iron, but of longing. Every wall of the royal palaces shimmered with blue and gold, every hall perfumed with the scent of roses, amber, and wine. Yet behind the splendor lurked a quiet tyranny, one not of brutality, but of seduction. The Persian monarchs, from Cyrus to Xerxes, learned to rule not merely with armies but with the senses. Theirs was an empire where the pleasures of the body were as sacred as the decrees of the gods, and where submission often came wrapped in silk rather than shackles. Visitors from conquered lands were dazzled by lavish banquets, by carpets that glowed like fire, and by dancers whose movements seemed to echo the divine order of the universe. Few realized until it was too late that these luxuries were traps, designed to bind through gratitude and intoxication. To the Persians, pleasure was not sin. It was order. The Zoroastrian belief system that guided their worldview saw creation as a battlefield between light and darkness, purity and corruption. Pleasure, in its refined form, was a reflection of cosmic harmony, an echo of divine perfection. But under royal hands, this ideal became something else entirely. The kings discovered that if pleasure could reflect the divine, it could also justify domination. Every feast, every kiss, every intoxicating scent became a silent assertion that the king was closer to the gods than any mortal could ever hope to be. The Persian monarch was no ordinary man. He was the king of kings, the living sun around which all existence revolved. His body was a symbol of the empire's perfection. His desires became law. When he smiled, thousands feasted. When he frowned, cities starved. His beauty, his calmness, his composure, these were tools of governance. Even his silence commanded worship. In the shimmering court of Susa or beneath the marble pillars of Persepolis, his every movement carried the weight of heaven itself. To defy the king's will was not rebellion, it was blasphemy. To please him, even briefly, was to taste immortality. In this world, pleasure was both a crown and a chain. It was a divine gift that uplifted and corrupted in equal measure. Persian rulers mastered this duality with chilling precision. They gave their subjects abundance, fine wines, exotic perfumes, and the soft comfort of submission, until resistance itself became unthinkable. Pleasure softened the will more efficiently than fear ever could. It created loyalty that pain could never achieve. To be enveloped in Persian splendor was to forget that one was conquered, to believe instead that one was chosen. The grandeur of the Persian world dazzled those who came from harsher, simpler lands. Greek envoys wrote with awe and unease of the banquets that lasted for days, where tables groaned beneath roasted game and fruit imported from across the empire, where music and perfume flowed as freely as the wine. They saw slaves carrying golden cups and eunuchs whispering secrets into the ears of queens. Yet beneath the shimmering surface, these scenes concealed a brutal hierarchy. Every smile was calculated, every indulgence a lesson in obedience. The empire did not need to break its subjects when it could seduce them instead. There was a chilling wisdom in this philosophy. The Persian kings understood that domination achieved through fear invites rebellion, but domination achieved through pleasure breeds dependence. A man who fears his ruler may dream of escape, but a man who loves his ruler, who hungers for his approval, who tastes the sweetness of his favor, will never leave even when the gates are open. In this way, pleasure became not merely a comfort but an instrument of political alchemy. It transformed enemies into adorers and servants into devotees. Yet for all its brilliance, this empire of desire carried a dark seed within. The same pleasures that conquered the hearts of men began to corrode the hearts of their masters. Luxury blurred into decadence, divinity into delusion. The Persian kings, once architects of control, became prisoners of their own intoxicating world. They could command armies, yet they could not command restraint. And as silk grew softer and wine grew sweeter, the line between power and indulgence began to disappear. But that unraveling belongs to later chapters. For now, the camera lingers on the height of their glory, on the blinding beauty of their world, where every scent, every touch, every taste carried the echo of divine authority. Here, in the heart of the empire, pleasure was not a weakness. It was the purest expression of control, a control so complete, so seductive, that it conquered not just lands and armies, but the very souls of men. And in this shimmering dawn of Persian civilization, a question begins to whisper through the corridors of gold. When pleasure becomes the language of power, how long before desire itself becomes the throne? The body of the Persian king was not merely flesh, it was the physical embodiment of the empire itself. To touch him was to touch the divine. To look upon him was to witness a living God. From the moment a prince ascended to the throne, his very existence became a ritual, a living ceremony that never ended. His gestures, his meals, his silences, all became sacred acts. This was not a man, but a symbol of cosmic order, chosen by Ahura Mazda to be the earthly reflection of celestial harmony. To the Persians, their ruler was the axis around which heaven and earth revolved, and his body was both throne and temple. In the courts of Persepolis and Susa, the king's body was guarded with fanatical devotion. No one could approach him unbidden. No one could speak to him directly without elaborate ritual. His garments were woven from the finest silks of India and dyed in the rarest purple pigments of Phoenicia. The scent that clung to him was a crafted illusion, a blend of frankincense, rose, and cinnamon that made him seem more apparition than man. Even his hair, his beard, and the jewels upon his crown followed divine geometry. Nothing about his body was ordinary. Every detail existed to remind those who beheld him that they were in the presence of something beyond mortal comprehension. In this atmosphere, intimacy became a political act. To be permitted near the king was not affection. It was privilege, a form of elevation reserved for the most loyal and most useful. The royal physicians who tended to his health, the eunuchs who dressed and guarded him, the wives and concubines chosen to share his bed, all were carefully selected extensions of his sacred form. They were not companions, but instruments of power, reflections of his perfection. Even his moments of private pleasure were orchestrated to maintain the illusion of divine control. When the king smiled, it was not warmth, it was radiance. When he touched another, it was not passion, it was sanctification. To rule in this way required not strength alone, but performance. The Persian monarch understood that power depended on perception, that to be obeyed without question, he must be seen as more than human. He must become myth in motion. His body was shielded by distance and ritual so that no flaw could ever be perceived. His meals were prepared with obsessive care, his surroundings purified daily, his very breath, some whispered, perfumed by the gods. The royal court moved like a theater of devotion. Nobles would prostrate themselves at the sight of his golden sandals. Servants dared not speak his name above a whisper. Even the air around him seemed heavy with command. Within the palace walls, everything revolved around this sacred flesh. The king's bedchamber was a world unto itself, guarded by eunuchs and perfumed with burning myrrh. Its silks were embroidered with stars, its pillars carved to resemble the wings of divine creatures. Here, the ruler did not simply rest, he communed with heaven. His dreams were believed to be messages from the divine, his passions omens of fate. When he took a woman into his arms, it was said that the union renewed the empire's strength, that pleasure itself flowed into the soil of Persia and nourished its dominion. Even his offspring carried the aura of divinity, for they were born not from lust, but from sacred union, the mingling of mortal and celestial will. The women of the royal household lived within this strange holiness. They were surrounded by unimaginable beauty, jeweled mirrors, gardens perfumed with jasmine, and musicians who played songs that seemed to dissolve time. Yet they were bound more tightly than any slave. To belong to the king was both blessing and imprisonment. They could possess every luxury, yet never possess themselves. Their eyes, their smiles, even their silence could be interpreted as political gestures. Every word was monitored, every movement watched. They were ornaments in a living shrine, symbols of fertility, loyalty, and submission to divine pleasure. Beyond the veil of the harem, the male courtiers and nobles mirrored this same pattern of worship. They competed not for land or honor, but for proximity, for a glance, a gesture, a moment in the presence of the divine body. The Persians called their ruler Kshayakshain, the king of kings, but to his inner circle he was more than that. He was the sun. Around him, men orbited like planets, reflecting his light and seeking warmth. The closer they drew, the more they risked destruction. One word from his lips could exalt a man to wealth beyond imagination. Another could erase his name from history. Desire for favor was both intoxicating and lethal. Even the rituals of punishment revolved around the sanctity of the king's flesh. To strike a royal servant was to strike the king's will. To insult the king's food, his garments, or his image was treason against the divine order. The body of the ruler defined justice itself. If he suffered, the empire suffered. If he prospered, the world seemed to bloom. The king's vitality became a political weather, and his desires, whether for conquest or for beauty, determined the fate of nations. But beneath this elaborate worship of the royal form, there was a quiet terror. The king himself was a prisoner of perfection. He could never be weak, never ill, never human. To reveal fatigue or sorrow would shatter the illusion of divinity and unravel the fabric of control. So, the Persian monarch lived encased in layers of ritual and beauty, a living god who could never confess to being a man. His pleasures were staged, his emotions curated, his very existence a performance. Power demanded not freedom, but absolute restraint, a paradox that gnawed at the soul of every ruler who sat upon the golden throne. And so the king's body became both the source and the symbol of control, an object of worship that enslaved both subject and sovereign. The courtiers trembled before him, the women adored and feared him, and yet behind his jeweled eyes lay a loneliness deeper than any dungeon. The empire believed that through his flesh, heaven touched the earth. But as the centuries passed, that divine touch grew colder. The king, once a vessel of the sacred, began to disappear beneath the weight of his own image. For the Persians, the body of their ruler was a mirror of cosmic order, flawless, radiant, eternal. But mirrors can fracture. And when the cracks began to appear, they would reveal something far darker, the machinery behind the myth, the system of control that hid beneath perfume and silk. The story of the Persian king's sacred body is not one of beauty alone, but of bondage, the subtle, exquisite tyranny of divinity trapped within human skin. Behind the towering gates of the Persian palace lay the most secret and misunderstood world of all, the royal harem. To outsiders, it was imagined as a paradise of beauty, a labyrinth of silken chambers where the king lived in endless pleasure surrounded by hundreds of women. To the Persians, however, it was something far more complex, not merely a chamber of indulgence, but an institution of empire, a mechanism through which desire was measured, managed, and weaponized. The harem was not a playground. It was a fortress. And within its walls, pleasure was bureaucracy. The Persian harem was a world within a world, governed by invisible rules and watched by eyes that never slept. At its heart stood the great king, whose presence was both a blessing and a threat. Around him revolved a meticulously organized hierarchy of women, queens of noble birth, concubines from conquered lands, dancers, servants, and slaves. Each woman's rank was determined by her proximity to the royal bed and by the influence she wielded beyond it. But no woman truly belonged to herself. Every gesture, every glance, every whisper could shift the delicate balance of favor and ruin. The harem's true masters were the eunuchs, men who had been sacrificed to serve. Their bodies were stripped of desire so that their loyalty could be pure, and their devotion undistracted. They guarded the entrances, carried the messages, and ensured that the line between the king's world and the outside world remained impenetrable. They knew every secret, every rivalry, every forbidden romance whispered in the perfumed shadows. And yet they too were prisoners of the system they maintained, bound by silence, enslaved by the very power they protected. Every woman within the harem was a thread in the empire's political web. Many had been brought from distant kingdoms as gifts, tributes, or tokens of submission. Their beauty was not just personal, it was political. To the Persians, each new concubine represented a conquest sealed not in blood but in flesh. By sharing the king's bed, she became a living treaty, her body a bridge between nations. The harem thus became a living archive of diplomacy, a place where desire replaced ink and alliance replaced affection. Pleasure was never just pleasure. It was the language of power. The daily life within these gilded walls was a choreography of luxury and surveillance. Dawn would arrive with music and scent. Servants fanned incense through the corridors while eunuchs called the women to their morning devotions. They dressed in layers of silk, each color symbolizing rank, pale blue for attendants, white and gold for favorites, crimson for those awaiting the king's summons. Meals were prepared in silence, accompanied by musicians whose songs told stories of gods and kings. Yet beneath the stillness lingered an invisible tension. Every woman knew that her place could change in an instant. A smile too bold, a word too soft, a rival's whisper could undo years of careful obedience. Historians speak of the harem intrigues with fascination, but they were more than gossip, they were acts of survival. Within this closed world, women learned to master subtle arts, manipulation through tenderness, influence through rumor, protection through charm. To win the king's attention was to gain immense power, to lose it was to vanish from existence. The queen, often the daughter of a noble house, ruled over this labyrinth with icy precision. Beneath her, favorites competed not merely for affection but for political leverage, for the ability to sway appointments, policies, even wars. The empire's fate could shift with the turning of the king's gaze. It is easy to imagine these women as victims, yet many were skilled strategists. They learned that the same beauty that enslaved them could also free them. Through careful alliances with eunuchs and courtiers, some manipulated the flow of information to shape the king's thoughts. A well-timed word whispered in the right ear could destroy an enemy or elevate a lover. The harem was the softest of prisons, but it was also the sharpest of weapons. Within its perfumed halls, the politics of empire played out with silken gloves and poisoned smiles. Even outside the palace, the influence of the harem was felt. Courtiers vied for the favor of those within, sending gifts and promises to the women who could whisper their names to the king. Generals sought the queen's approval before campaigns. Ministers paid silent homage to concubines whose laughter could change their fortunes. The king's pleasure thus became the axis upon which the machinery of empire turned. Decisions that shaped nations were born not in council chambers, but in the scented darkness of the royal chambers. The harem was also a mirror of the empire's diversity. Within its walls lived women from Egypt, Babylon, Greece, and the distant lands of India. Each brought her own customs, languages, and gods. The result was a strange and shimmering unity, a miniature version of Persia itself, bound together by the will of one man. Yet that unity was fragile, sustained by fear and fascination. The women might share feasts and laughter, but every smile carried calculation. Each act of kindness might conceal betrayal. Theirs was a world where love could be fatal and beauty a form of espionage. And through it all, the king remained at the center, unseen, yet omnipresent. His presence haunted every mirror, every dream, every rivalry. The women spoke of him as if he were both deity and lover, their lives orbiting his unseen desires. For some, to be chosen by him was to achieve immortality. For others, it was to vanish into legend and loneliness. The harem existed to feed his divinity, to remind the empire that the king's power extended even into the most private corners of human longing. But this system came at a cost. Behind the marble walls and silver lamps lay quiet tragedies, women who aged unseen, who faded into anonymity once their beauty dimmed. Those who had been worshipped as divine vessels of desire became ghosts, living relics of forgotten nights. For them, the harem was eternity without meaning, luxury without freedom. They had been taught to wield pleasure as power, yet in the end, pleasure wielded them. The Persian harem was not the paradise of exotic fantasy that later cultures imagined. It was an empire within an empire, ruled by silence and scent, by beauty and fear. Its perfection was its cruelty. Every luxury concealed a trap, every affection carried a price. And yet, in its cold brilliance, it revealed one of humanity's oldest truths, that pleasure, once organized and weaponized, can enslave more effectively than chains or war. The harem stood as both the heart and the wound of Persian power, a living monument to control disguised as devotion. It was the theater where the empire rehearsed its most seductive illusion, that love could be commanded, loyalty could be purchased, and the soul itself could be governed through desire. There was an art to intoxication in ancient Persia, a science of seduction that blended philosophy, chemistry, and ceremony into one mesmerizing ritual of control. To the Persians, pleasure was not chaos but architecture. The banquet table was a throne of its own, a place where conquest was reaffirmed and obedience was sweetened by wine. Every scent, every flavor, every melody was arranged to draw the mind toward surrender. The empire understood that the easiest way to conquer a man's will was not through pain or fear, but through his senses. Pleasure was the invisible chain, and intoxication was the lock that sealed it. The royal banquets of the Persian court were events of unimaginable splendor. Guests entered great halls lined with marble and gold, the air heavy with incense that seemed to shimmer in the torchlight. Musicians played instruments from every corner of the empire, lutes from Media, flutes from Egypt, drums from Babylon, weaving a tapestry of sound that filled the soul with awe. The king would sit elevated above all others, not as a host but as a god among mortals. Before him stretched tables overflowing with roasted meats, fruits glazed with honey, and wine poured from crystal decanters shaped like lions and eagles. Yet this was no simple feast. It was theater. Every gesture, every toast, every drop of wine served a purpose. Persian kings were masters of perception. They understood that generosity could disarm faster than violence. When foreign envoys were invited to these banquets, they believed they were being honored. In truth, they were being tested. Servants would ensure their cups were never empty, while the king's gaze watched from afar, measuring how quickly they drank, how easily they laughed, how openly they spoke once their inhibitions dissolved. The wine of Persia was both a gift and a trap. It loosened tongues, revealed loyalties, and stripped away resistance. In that haze of delight and surrender, the guests often gave more than they realized: secrets, alliances, or the quiet admission of admiration that would bind them forever to the Persian crown. The intoxicants of Persia went far beyond wine. The empire's apothecaries were renowned for their mastery of herbs, resins, and elixirs. They knew how to blend scents and flavors that could relax the mind or ignite desire. Perfumes made from rose, saffron, and sandalwood were not mere ornaments. They were instruments of control. When these scents filled a room, the mind softened, defenses weakened. Guests would find themselves lulled into a state of half-reverent trance, where beauty blurred into obedience. It was a form of sensory hypnosis, a spiritual intoxication in which submission felt divine. The banquets often began with ritual purity, hands washed in rosewater, prayers murmured to Ahura Mazda. But as the hours passed, formality gave way to indulgence. Dancers entered the halls, their movements slow and deliberate, their garments whispering with gold threads. Their bodies were symbols, representing the unity of the empire, one movement for Babylon, another for Lydia, a gesture for Egypt. The sight of them was not mere entertainment, it was education. The guests were reminded that the Persian king's rule extended not only across nations but through the very essence of beauty and pleasure itself. At the height of these feasts, when laughter rang loudest and reason had dissolved into euphoria, the king would speak, calmly, softly, with the authority of a god whispering through silk. His words would seem kind, even fatherly. He might compliment a guest's bravery, praise a province's loyalty, or announce a new campaign. In that moment, those present were no longer political adversaries or cautious envoys, they were disciples, bound by the shared intoxication of divine favor. The king did not need to threaten or demand. The wine, the music, the perfume had already done his work. They had replaced fear with fascination. To the Persians, intoxication was a mirror of the cosmos. It dissolved the barriers between the mortal and the divine, allowing the soul to glimpse paradise. But in the hands of the kings, it became an instrument of psychological mastery. The more luxurious the banquet, the deeper the surrender it provoked. The empire had learned that the path to dominance lay not in humiliation, but in admiration. When a man began to desire what enslaved him, his freedom was already lost. The courtiers, too, were caught in this velvet net. Every evening they lived in anticipation of the king's favor. To be invited to his table was an honor that could elevate a family for generations. But the privilege was perilous. Too much confidence, a misplaced jest, or a hint of arrogance could end careers or lives. The court was a game of intoxication where no one could ever truly be sober, where loyalty was measured by laughter and betrayal by silence. Men learned to mask their fear with smiles, their ambition with flattery. In that shimmering world of wine and gold, truth was the first casualty. There were stories whispered by travelers, of Persian nobles who deliberately feigned drunkenness to hide their emotions, or of kings who used rare narcotic wines to read the hearts of those who dined with them. In these feasts, the boundaries between politics, religion, and sensuality vanished. To refuse a drink was to insult the king's divinity. To drink too much was to reveal one's weakness. Between these extremes, every courtier learned to navigate the delicate dance of loyalty and survival. Even the environment was engineered to manipulate the senses. The halls were designed with polished stone that reflected the glow of torches, making the space appear endless, dreamlike. Water channels carved through the floors released cool air and the scent of flowers from the gardens outside. The sound of fountains mingled with music, creating a hypnotic rhythm that lulled the mind into serenity. Guests often described feeling as if they had stepped out of time, as if the palace itself were breathing around them. In this atmosphere, resistance felt not only futile, it felt sacrilegious. The art of intoxication extended beyond the palace walls. In cities like Ecbatana and Pasargadae, festivals were held where citizens were encouraged to feast and celebrate in honor of the king. These public rituals blurred the line between worship and indulgence. The people learned to associate their ruler's power with the joy of their own senses. Each sip of wine, each song of praise, reinforced the illusion that the king was the source of all pleasure, the divine provider of life's sweetness. Yet beneath the ecstasy, a quiet truth simmered. This orchestrated pleasure was never about happiness. It was about control. The empire's genius lay in its understanding that to rule the body was to rule the mind, and that the man who owned your joy owned your soul. The intoxicating perfection of Persian court life was a gilded trap, and those who entered it, whether foreign ambassadors, courtiers, or concubines, found that leaving was impossible. Once you had tasted the honey of the empire, ordinary life became flavorless. The Persians had mastered a form of domination that required no chains and no whips. Their empire was not held together by cruelty but by seduction, by the careful crafting of experiences that made submission feel like paradise. It was not a tyranny of pain but a tyranny of pleasure, and it worked more deeply, more invisibly, than any sword could. And as the night deepened and the last cup was drained, the guests would stagger from the banquet hall dazed and smiling, unaware that they had been conquered. The Empire of Persia had no need to spill blood that night. It had achieved something far more enduring, the conquest of the human will through the sweetness of surrender. In the shadowed corridors of Persian power, where men wore gold like armor and silence carried the weight of law, there existed another empire, invisible, whispering, and every bit as dangerous as the throne itself. It was ruled not by soldiers or kings, but by women. They were queens, concubines, and courtiers' daughters, each a player in the delicate theater of pleasure and control. They lived behind veils and walls of marble, yet their influence stretched across continents. Their weapons were not swords or armies, but glances, rumors, and the sacred art of persuasion. History remembers them faintly, if at all, but their fingerprints are on every secret that shaped the Persian world. The official chronicles spoke of the King of Kings, radiant and divine, yet even the mightiest ruler needed an audience, someone who saw the man beneath the god, who knew his fears, his hunger, and his vanity. That audience, that mirror, was often a woman. Within the harem's silken labyrinth, certain women rose above the hundreds who served. They learned to read the moods behind the king's silence, to bend affection into influence, to turn jealousy into strategy. They were not simply his lovers, they were his confessors, his counselors, his unseen equals. And sometimes, they were his undoing. Foremost among them stands the figure of Queen Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and wife to Darius I. She was born into power and understood its language better than most men. When Darius seized the throne after a turbulent rebellion, Atossa's legitimacy as a royal bloodline soothed the empire's doubts. But she offered more than heritage, she offered intellect. Ancient accounts suggest that it was Atossa who first persuaded Darius to expand his empire into Greece, not through reckless ambition but through the promise of glory that would make Persia eternal. Her words, spoken in the intimacy of the bedchamber, altered the course of history. Through affection she commanded an empire. Then there was Persides, the formidable queen mother of Artaxerxes II, a woman whose cruelty and cunning became legend. Chroniclers described her as both tender and terrifying, capable of disarming her enemies with a smile before destroying them utterly. She ruled the court through fear and fascination, orchestrating alliances and executions alike from behind her veil. Her power lay in her invisibility. She never needed to appear to control the world. It was said that even the king himself hesitated to cross her, for she knew the secret that sustained every monarchy, that the one who controls the affections of the ruler controls the realm. These women were products of their cage, and masters of it. The harem, for all its beauty, was a prison gilded in silk. Yet within those confines, the intelligent and the ruthless discovered that emotion could be molded into command. A tear could delay a war. A sigh could seal a treaty. A whispered story could turn one noble against another, changing the fate of provinces. Power did not lie in defiance but in performance. To survive in the harem, a woman had to act constantly, to be innocent when watched, manipulative when ignored, and powerful only through subtlety. The Persian court valued women for their grace, their purity, their ability to inspire desire, but it feared them too. The same beauty that delighted the king could also destroy him. The eunuchs who guarded the harem whispered that too much affection from the king could doom a man faster than rebellion. For every favored queen, there were 100 forgotten faces, abandoned to shadows and jealousy. Poison, rumor, and whispered curses became the currency of survival. And yet amid this danger, the women learned an unspoken truth. Control was never granted, it was taken. The harem's hierarchy was fluid, built on shifting sands of favoritism and suspicion. A single night of intimacy could elevate a woman to divine status. A single misstep could banish her to oblivion. Those who rose highest learned to cultivate mystery. They veiled not just their faces but their intentions, speaking in half-truths that kept even the eunuchs guessing. Some would feign illness to summon the king's concern. Others would plant dreams, omens of destiny that the priests conveniently confirmed the next morning. These performances blurred the lines between love and manipulation until neither the king nor his subjects could tell where devotion ended and domination began. The women's influence extended far beyond the harem walls. Their brothers, fathers, and sons held courtly positions thanks to their favor. Generals gained commands through the queen's whispered approval. Merchants won contracts because of a concubine's smile. Even ambassadors from distant lands sought the favor of these unseen powers, sending jewels, perfumes, and secrets to win their attention. The king may have been the empire's son, but it was the women who controlled the shadows, and the shadows often determined where the light would fall. Yet their reign came at a terrible cost. Every act of cunning, every manipulation, deepened their isolation. They could never reveal their true feelings, for vulnerability was fatal. Love was both weapon and weakness. Some fell in love with the king and were destroyed by jealousy. Others used love so skillfully that they forgot what it once felt like. Over time, even victory turned hollow. The queens and concubines who survived into old age often found themselves surrounded by wealth but starved of meaning. Their beauty had been currency, their charm a mask, and their power a performance that could never end. In the silence of the harem's inner chambers, one can imagine these women sitting before mirrors framed in gold, staring at the reflections that had conquered kings but could not save themselves. Their faces, painted and perfect, hid decades of secrets: lovers betrayed, enemies buried, sons crowned and murdered. They had shaped the empire's destiny, but history gave them no names. The scrolls remembered their husbands, their sons, their dynasties, never their voices. They became the ghosts of power, immortal yet invisible. Still, the echoes of their influence lingered through centuries. The Persians had learned from them that control was not brute force but seduction, that persuasion, when refined to art, was stronger than command. The legacy of these royal women became woven into Persian identity itself. The idea that beauty could be authority, that softness could conceal strategy, that desire could govern empires. Later rulers and conquerors, even Alexander, even the Roman emperors, would inherit this understanding without realizing where it had begun, in the veiled chambers of Susa and Persepolis, where women learned to rule without thrones. Their story is not one of romance, but of resilience, of intelligence born from confinement, of power that bloomed in captivity. They turned their gilded prison into a court of influence, proving that even in a world built for men, the mind and spirit could find ways to dominate unseen. In the empire of pleasure, they were both victims and architects, caught between worship and suspicion, wielding the same tools that enslaved them. In the end, the women of the Persian court stand as the most haunting paradox of their civilization, creatures of luxury who lived like strategists, guardians of love who mastered deceit, prisoners who commanded kings. Their veils were their crowns, their silence their weapon. And through their whispered words and calculated tenderness, they taught the empire and the world a truth that would outlive them all, that sometimes the most absolute form of power does not roar. It smiles. The heart of the Persian Empire was not merely built on war, gold, or faith. It was built on rituals of pleasure that transcended the body and reached into the soul. For the Persian kings, pleasure was not indulgence. It was a sacred act, a form of order that mirrored the harmony of the cosmos. To understand how pleasure became a weapon of control, one must step inside the temples, the banquets, and the perfumed chambers where the line between ecstasy and submission blurred into divine choreography. Persian philosophy, deeply influenced by Zoroastrian dualism, saw the universe as a battlefield between light and darkness, purity and corruption. To maintain order, the king, the Shahanshah, the king of kings, had to embody Asha, the cosmic truth. But truth in this sense was not sterile or ascetic. It was vital, radiant, and deeply sensual. Beauty, harmony, and pleasure were not distractions. They were proofs of divine favor. The king's ability to experience and distribute pleasure was seen as evidence of his alignment with cosmic order. In his palace, feasts and intimate rituals became sacred ceremonies. Every gesture, every scent, every note of the lyre reinforcing his divine legitimacy. But beneath this grandeur lay an intricate network of control and performance. The rituals of pleasure were designed not only to please the king but to remind everyone of their place within the hierarchy. At royal banquets, nobles reclined on embroidered cushions as dancers, musicians, and courtesans enacted scenes of myth and passion. These performances were more than entertainment. They were allegories of submission. The dancers symbolized provinces, the musicians symbolized harmony, the women who served wine represented the bounty of the earth. And presiding over it all, the king, silent, composed, watched as the entire world bowed to his pleasure. Every act of sensual indulgence was political theater. When the king accepted a cup of wine from a favored concubine, it was not just affection, it was a message. To his court, it signaled her influence. To his rivals, it reminded them of their distance from the source of favor. Pleasure became a language of dominance, where intimacy was a tool sharper than any blade. To please the king was to exist, to displease him was to vanish. Thus, desire itself became law, and those who understood its grammar could survive within the deadly poetry of the Persian court. Among the most elaborate of these rituals were the midnight feasts, private ceremonies known only to the inner circle of the court. The king, surrounded by perfumed lamps and rare wines from Babylon, would preside over a gathering where music, philosophy, and seduction intertwined. The air thickened with myrrh and the scent of burning sandalwood. The courtiers debated virtue and pleasure while poets recited verses comparing the king's face to the rising sun. Every sound, every word, every motion was choreographed to glorify him, to remind all that even desire itself bent to his will. In these secret rituals, the Persians blurred the boundaries between sacred and profane, between divine ecstasy and human lust. Pleasure was a form of communication with the gods, a way to renew the cosmic balance. Yet it also served a colder purpose, to test loyalty. The king could summon pleasure as swiftly as he could withdraw it. A favorite musician could be elevated to wealth one night and executed the next morning for a misplaced note or a wandering glance. The participants in these ceremonies learned that beauty and terror were twins, born of the same divine will. The very hands that caressed could just as easily condemn. One of the most striking rituals recorded in later accounts was the festival of Mitra, where light and fire symbolized truth. In certain interpretations of this ceremony, the king would sit upon a throne surrounded by dancers clad in gold and crimson. As the torches flared, they would circle him, moving in patterns that mimicked the stars' rotation. The king's pleasure during this ritual was not indulgence but representation. His body was the axis of the world. To touch him was to touch the sun. To please him was to ensure the world's order. The pleasure of the king thus became a metaphor for universal harmony, and denying him that pleasure was akin to defying the divine. The deeper meaning of these ceremonies was psychological. The Persians understood that control through fear bred rebellion, but control through desire bred devotion. Pleasure softened resistance. It replaced obedience born of duty with obedience born of longing. The king's charisma became a form of hypnosis. Courtiers sought not merely to survive but to be seen, to be the object of his pleasure, the bearer of his favor. In this way, pleasure functioned as the most subtle, most enduring form of domination, one that made submission feel like privilege. Even religion reflected this ideology. Zoroastrian priests often spoke of the soul's journey toward light as an act of purification, not rejection of the physical, but mastery over it. The king's feasts, his sensual ceremonies, his harem, all were justified as reflections of divine abundance. The body, when disciplined by order and ritual, became sacred. Pleasure, therefore, was not condemned but sanctified, so long as it remained under the king's control. This philosophy transformed indulgence into statecraft, turning every act of pleasure into an instrument of rule. Yet, beneath the fragrance and the music, a darker current flowed. Many who participated in these rituals came to understand that they were not celebrating pleasure, but serving it. The same ecstasy that elevated the king reduced others to instruments, human offerings in a silent ritual of power. Pleasure, like pain, became a form of sacrifice. Those who performed in these ceremonies, dancers, concubines, servants, often lived brief, brilliant lives, consumed by the very system they sustained. To them, the ritual of pleasure was not a path to divine harmony but a slow, exquisite annihilation. Over time, as the Persian Empire expanded, these rituals evolved. Conquered peoples brought their own customs, and the court absorbed them all. The fertility rites of Babylon, the intoxicating feasts of Lydia, the perfumed baths of Egypt. Each edition enriched the empire's sensual language and reinforced the idea that Persia was not merely a kingdom but a cosmic order. To conquer Persia, one had to conquer its pleasure, and no one ever truly did. Even Alexander, who stood in the ruins of Persepolis, succumbed to its spell. The luxury he found there, the music, the wine, the soft-spoken attendants, haunted him until his death. Pleasure was Persia's true empire, invisible, eternal, and more seductive than any army. It survived the fall of dynasties and the ruin of palaces because it was built not of stone or gold, but of desire itself. In the rituals of pleasure, the Persians discovered a truth that civilizations have repeated ever since. The body can be ruled through fear, but the soul can only be ruled through longing. In this balance of ecstasy and obedience, Persia achieved something terrifyingly elegant. A civilization where beauty was law, pleasure was duty, and control was divine. Behind every feast and every whispered song lay the same unspoken truth, that those who can define pleasure can define power. And as long as the king commanded both, the empire would remain his body, mind, and soul. They called him shadow of God on earth. The Persians did not believe their king was merely mortal. To them, he was the earthly reflection of Ahura Mazda's divine order, a living conduit between heaven and humankind. Every act he performed, every emotion he displayed, was imbued with sacred significance. But divinity demanded distance. The king could not show weakness, not even in joy. His pleasures were not his own, they belonged to the empire. And it was through this strange alchemy, where human desire met divine authority, that the Persian kings turned pleasure itself into religion. The royal court became a temple without priests. The rituals of pleasure, the feasts, the perfumes, the sensual ceremonies, were not seen as indulgence but as spiritual duty. To feel was to affirm creation, to delight was to mirror the harmony of the cosmos. When the king feasted, he reenacted the abundance of the gods. When he loved, he was believed to renew the fertility of the world. The Persian notion of kingship blurred the boundaries between worship and desire, transforming the king's body into a symbol of both divine light and mortal fragility. At the center of this theology stood the god Mitra, guardian of truth, contracts, and the sacred bond between ruler and ruled. Mitra was the deity of loyalty, the invisible witness to every promise. His rituals, often performed in secrecy, celebrated both light and fire, both destruction and creation. The Persians believed that Mitra's power flowed through the king, making his pleasures more than personal indulgences. They were cosmic affirmations, each one a declaration that the universe remained in balance. To deny the king pleasure, or to corrupt it, was not just rebellion, it was blasphemy. In this system, pleasure was both sacred and surveilled. Every expression of affection, every dance, every drop of wine that touched royal lips had meaning. Priests observed, interpreted, and sanctified these moments as if they were prayers. The royal harem was therefore not a den of lust but a living altar, where beauty served theology and seduction became liturgy. The women who lived within its walls were not merely companions, they were vessels of divine symbolism. Their beauty represented the perfection of creation, their submission the harmony of cosmic order. Yet behind this sanctified narrative was an undercurrent of terror. The king's supposed divinity isolated him completely. If his pleasure sustained the empire, then his pain could destroy it. This burden created a paradox. He was adored as a god but condemned to live as a prisoner of ritual. Every sigh, every glance, was watched. Every act of affection was both genuine and political. The people worshipped him, but they also feared what might happen if his emotions fell out of balance. The divinity of the Persian king was thus both a blessing and a curse, a crown woven from gold and loneliness. To maintain this illusion of divine control, the kings performed acts of ascetic contrast, public renunciations of pleasure that magnified their restraint. Records from Achaemenid and later Parthian traditions describe kings fasting for purification before great campaigns or abstaining from intimacy during months of sacred observance. These deprivations were not moral tests but theatrical demonstrations of cosmic equilibrium. The king showed that he could command not only armies and provinces but even his own desires. His control over himself justified his control over others. The public saw his restraint as proof of his divine authority, while the private chambers remained the realm of sacred indulgence. The priests of Ahura Mazda reinforced this duality. They taught that the world was a battleground between Asha, truth and order, and Druj, chaos and deceit. Pleasure, they warned, was the most dangerous battlefield of all. It could purify or corrupt, uplift or destroy. The king's role was to experience pleasure without falling into excess, to remain master of desire, not its slave. When he succeeded, the realm flourished. When he failed, famine, rebellion, and decay followed. In this way, the king's pleasure became the empire's moral compass. His personal discipline determined the fate of millions. Over time, this ideology produced a new kind of spirituality, one that united body and soul, ecstasy and discipline. Persian art, architecture, and poetry reflected this synthesis. Palaces were designed like temples, with flowing gardens symbolizing eternal paradise. Every fountain, every column, every petal carved in stone was a reflection of divine abundance. Yet these spaces also whispered a warning: beauty was sacred, but only when contained. The moment it overflowed, when desire became uncontrollable, it turned from holy to heretical. And so, within this sacred empire of pleasure, the Persian king lived as both priest and prisoner. His power rested on illusion, the illusion that his desires were divine, his pleasures flawless, his control unshakable. The court reinforced this belief with every ritual. Musicians tuned their instruments to celestial harmonies, dancers moved like stars orbiting his throne. When he smiled, courtiers saw the dawn of creation. When he frowned, they felt the tremor of apocalypse. To displease him was not just political suicide, it was cosmic treason. But beneath the splendor, cracks appeared. The human heart, even beneath crowns, remains fragile. Some kings, like Xerxes, who wept upon seeing his vast army knowing they would all be dead within a century, revealed moments of aching humanity. In those rare glimpses, the divine mask slipped, and the man beneath was exposed, vulnerable, lonely, and burdened by the very perfection expected of him. These moments terrified the court because they reminded everyone that the divine order they worshipped was built on the trembling emotions of a single man. Later kings tried to hide their weakness through even greater displays of divine ritual. They surrounded themselves with magi, seers, and dream interpreters who assured them that every pleasure they experienced was sanctioned by the gods. Yet in this endless performance, something essential was lost: the difference between faith and fear, between love and obedience. The religion of pleasure became the religion of control, where piety was measured by how well one pleased the ruler. The sacred flame of Mitra still burned, but its light no longer purified, it blinded. Still, the philosophical core of this tradition endured. The Persians believed that creation itself was born from desire, that the universe emerged when the divine longed to see itself reflected. Pleasure, then, was not sin but genesis. It was life's first spark, the rhythm by which existence danced into being. The tragedy of the Persian kings was that they mistook this universal longing for personal right. They believed they could own pleasure, command it, contain it, and in doing so, they made it their prison. In the dim halls of Persepolis, where reliefs still depict kings receiving tribute beneath winged symbols of divinity, one can almost feel that contradiction lingering in the air. The fragrance of incense, the gleam of gold, the perfect stillness of carved faces, all speak of a civilization that worshipped beauty yet was haunted by it. Pleasure was their god and their curse, their salvation and their downfall. The Persians understood a truth too complex for their time and perhaps too dangerous for ours: that pleasure, when sanctified by power, ceases to liberate. It becomes law. And in that transformation, from desire to decree, from ecstasy to obligation, lay the soul of the Persian Empire, radiant, disciplined, and eternally yearning for a divine perfection that no mortal, not even a king, could ever truly possess. When pleasure became the language of kings, cruelty found new disguises. By the height of the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian court had transformed control into ritual, and indulgence into obedience. Pleasure was no longer a privilege of the ruler alone. It was a currency of submission, distributed to those who served, withdrawn from those who defied. The result was a system that appeared soft but was sharper than any blade. To lose favor in this world of silk was to lose everything: wealth, comfort, and even identity. For in a realm built on pleasure, deprivation was the cruelest punishment of all. The royal court had perfected this balance of sweetness and suffering. Within the walls of Persepolis, harmony masked hierarchy. Nobles dined beneath ceilings painted like the heavens, musicians played songs meant to pacify the soul, and perfumed servants attended to every whim. Yet behind the music and scent of wine was a silent code. The king's pleasure was sacred law. Any failure to please, whether in word, gesture, or devotion, could end in disgrace. Public execution was rare. Instead, the Persians preferred psychological punishment, exile, humiliation, or removal from the court's pleasures. To live without luxury in such a world was a death of the spirit. Even love was weaponized. The royal harems, often imagined as places of indulgence, were in truth the empire's most intricate prisons. Every smile, every glance, every act of intimacy was part of a hierarchy of favor. Women competed not for affection but for survival. The king's attention meant power, his silence meant erasure. Those who fell from grace vanished into quiet exile, their names erased from songs and stories. In this way, the Persians achieved what few empires could: they made obedience feel like desire itself. Yet beneath this gilded structure, cracks began to show. Generations of rulers inherited a throne built on pleasure but forgot the discipline that had once balanced it. The later kings mistook refinement for strength, ritual for purpose. Feasts grew longer, rituals more elaborate, and sincerity rarer. The empire began to decay not through war but through the corrosion of indulgence. Soldiers lost discipline, courtiers whispered more than they served, and the moral gravity that had once bound the empire gave way to decadence. Still, their cruelty remained elegant. Rather than crush rebellion through blood, the Persians learned to dissolve it through comfort. Dissidents were not executed, they were absorbed. Conquered nobles were offered fine clothes, music, and golden chains of privilege until they forgot rebellion. This was the death of mercy, not in slaughter, but in seduction. Mercy was no longer an act of grace, but a calculated offering meant to bind rather than free. Psychologically, it was genius. The Persian kings ruled not only over land but over emotion itself. They rewrote the definition of loyalty. To be loyal was to seek the king's approval, to crave his gaze. In return, the king became less a man and more an idea, the living embodiment of divine pleasure. His satisfaction was seen as the axis of the cosmos, his discontent a sign of cosmic imbalance. To defy him was to defy the universe's order itself. Thus, control was complete, yet invisible. But this divine masquerade came with a cost. As generations passed, the line between worship and flattery blurred. Truth vanished from the royal halls, replaced by performance. Ministers spoke in riddles of praise, servants smiled through fear, and even the king became prisoner to his own illusion, a man adored, but never loved. The weapon he had forged from pleasure turned inward, dulling his judgment and isolating his soul. Surrounded by delight, he could no longer tell loyalty from deceit, beauty from decay. When Alexander's armies finally approached, the once terrifying empire did not shatter in defiance, it sighed in exhaustion. The people who had once sung of divine kingship now whispered in secret that their rulers had become hollow. The conqueror did not destroy Persia's greatness. He merely swept away the illusions that had already rotted from within. The empire that had ruled through pleasure finally drowned in it. And yet, their legacy endured. The Persians taught the world an immortal truth, that when power learns to hide behind grace, cruelty can exist without guilt. Their art, their ceremony, their beauty, all were born from an attempt to control chaos through pleasure. But as history proved, the more perfectly control is disguised, the more devastating its collapse becomes. The death of mercy, for the Persians, was not a moment of violence. It was the slow, elegant suffocation of empathy beneath layers of gold and incense. The story of Persia's fall, then, is not one of conquest, but of consumption. The empire consumed itself from within. Its kings forgot that pleasure was meant to serve the soul, not enslave it. They turned a divine gift into an instrument of fear. In doing so, they revealed one of the oldest truths of civilization. When pleasure replaces mercy, when beauty serves control, even the most radiant empire will someday stand silent beneath the desert sun. When the once golden halls of Persepolis fell silent, the true empire of the Persian kings did not die, it simply changed form. Their palaces turned to dust, but their philosophy endured, the belief that pleasure could command loyalty more deeply than fear ever could. Across centuries, rulers and empires borrowed this secret, from Roman banquets to Ottoman harems, from Versailles to modern screens that seduce rather than enslave. The Persians had discovered a truth that still defines us, that people are ruled not by force, but by what they long for. They mastered the art of turning desire into obedience, harmony into hierarchy. But in doing so, they unleashed a paradox, for no one, not even a king, can truly control the hunger of the human heart. Now, the ruins of Persepolis whisper their quiet warning through the desert wind. Pleasure without conscience becomes power without mercy. The Persian kings once ruled with silk and song, believing they had mastered beauty itself. Yet in the end, beauty mastered them. Their story is not just history, it is prophecy. Wherever desire is used to rule, paradise will always carry the shadow of its own fall.